Good evening. This is Evelyn Brooks, and you're listening to Echoes of 1970. Tonight, I'm holding a letter. The paper is yellow now, fragile, almost translucent. It was written by a woman named Margaret Chen. She was a lighthouse keeper on the coast of Maine, 32 years old, alone for most of her life, and on December 9th, 1970, she heard something that would change everything she believed about solitude. I can hear the rain against my window right now as I read this. It's fitting, somehow. Margaret wasn't supposed to be there, you know. Women weren't lighthouse keepers back then, not officially, but her father had been the keeper for 40 years, and when he died that autumn, she simply stayed. The Coast Guard didn't know. The town didn't ask questions. She kept the light burning every night, and that was enough. She wrote in this letter that she liked the silence. She said most people are afraid of being alone, but she found peace in it. The ocean was her only companion, and it never asked her to be anything other than what she was. Her father had been a quiet man, a man of routines and old sailors' superstitions. He taught her how to trim the wick, how to polish the lens until it was perfectly clear, how to read the weather in the color of the sky. He taught her that the lighthouse wasn't just a job. It was a promise to every ship out there in the dark that someone was watching, someone cared whether they made it home. When he died, Margaret buried him in the small cemetery overlooking the bay. She didn't cry at the funeral. The townspeople thought she was cold. But Margaret told me in this letter that she cried every night for 3 months afterward, alone in the lamp room, where no one could see. I'm looking at the envelope now. The postmark is faded, but I can still make it out. November 1989. That's when she sent this to me, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The lighthouse stood on a rocky point called Widow's Watch. I looked it up when I first received this letter. It got that name back in the 1850s, when a schooner went down in a storm, and 7 men drowned within sight of the shore. Their wives stood on those rocks for days, waiting for bodies that never washed up. After that, people said the point was cursed. They said you could hear women crying when the wind came in from the northeast. Margaret said she never heard crying. Just the wind, just the gulls, just the bellbuoy clanging 2 miles out, marking the shoals. She had a routine. Every evening at dusk, she'd climb the 73 steps to the lamp room. She'd light the oil lamp. This was before they electrified it. And she'd watch the beams swing out across the water. 4 seconds of light, 2 seconds of darkness. 4 seconds of light, 2 seconds of darkness. That rhythm became her heartbeat. She wrote that the hardest part wasn't the loneliness. It was the sameness. Every day identical to the one before. She'd wake at dawn, check the lens for salt spray, polish the brass fittings, refill the oil reservoir, inspect the machinery. Then she'd go down to the keeper's house, a small stone cottage attached to the base of the tower, and she'd cook a simple meal. Oatmeal, usually. Sometimes fish if the boats had come in. She'd read in the afternoon. Her father had left behind a collection of maritime logs dating back to 1891, and she read them cover to cover, learning about storms that happened before she was born, ships with names like Arabella and Compass Rose and Evening Star. In October, a supply boat came once a week. A man named Vernon Kowalski would bring her lamp oil, canned goods, flour, coffee. He was in his 60s, missing 2 fingers from a fishing accident. He never asked why she was still there. He'd just unload the supplies, take her payment, and leave. Margaret appreciated that. She didn't want to explain herself. But by November, the supply boat stopped coming. The weather turned. The storms rolled in one after another, and the sea was too rough for Vernon's little boat. Margaret had enough supplies to last through December if she was careful. She rationed the coffee. She ate 1 meal a day. And every night, without fail, she climbed those 73 steps and kept the light burning. December came. The cold was brutal that year. Margaret wrote that she could see her breath inside the keeper's house, even with the stove going. Ice formed on the inside of the windows. She wore 2 sweaters, her father's old coat, and wool socks to bed. On December 7th, she noticed something strange. I can feel my hands trembling slightly as I read this part. The logbook was open on the table. She was certain she'd closed it the night before. She always closed it. But when she came downstairs that morning, it was open. And not to the current page. It was open to an entry from 1889. She read it while drinking her coffee. I have the entry here. She copied it into her letter to me. I'll read it exactly as she wrote it. December 9th, 1889. Keeper's log. Heavy fog tonight. Visibility near zero. At approximately 11:47 p.m., observed a woman on the rocks below the lighthouse. She appeared to be searching for something. Called out to her, but received no response. By the time I descended with a lantern, she was gone. No footprints, no sign of entry or exit. The sea was calm. I do not understand what I saw. Margaret said she read that entry 3 times. Then she closed the book and told herself it was just a coincidence. Old buildings settle. Books fall open. There's always an explanation. But that night, December 8th, she couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. Around midnight, she heard something downstairs. A soft sound, like footsteps. She sat up. Her heart was pounding. She listened. Nothing. She told herself it was the wood contracting in the cold. She lay back down. And then she heard it again. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the floor below her. Margaret got out of bed. She didn't turn on a light. She stood at the top of the stairs, looking down into the darkness of the keeper's house. "Hello?" she called out. No answer. She descended the stairs slowly, gripping the railing. When she reached the bottom, she lit a candle. The keeper's house was empty. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. The logbook on the table. The stove still warm. Her father's coat hanging by the door. But the front door was open. Just a few inches. Enough to let in the cold. Margaret walked to the door and looked outside. The beam from the lighthouse swept across the rocks, illuminating the narrow path that led down to the water. She saw nothing. No one. Just the endless black of the ocean and the white foam of the waves breaking against the shore. She closed the door, locked it, checked it twice, and then she heard the singing. I'm going to pause for just a moment. I need you to understand something. Margaret Chen was not a woman given to flights of fancy. She lived a practical life. She understood the sounds an old building makes. She knew how wind could whistle through cracks, how water could drip and echo. She was not afraid of the dark or of being alone. But what she heard that night was not wind. It was not the building settling. It was singing. It was coming from inside the lighthouse, not from the keeper's house, from the tower itself, from somewhere above her. Margaret stood frozen in the doorway between the house and the tower entrance. The singing was soft, distant, a woman's voice, a lullaby in a language she didn't recognize. She told herself she was imagining it, that the wind could sound like anything if you were tired enough, scared enough. But the singing didn't stop. It continued, steady and low, coming from somewhere up in the spiral of the staircase. Margaret picked up the candle. Her hand was shaking so badly the flame flickered. She stepped into the tower. The staircase was a tight spiral of iron steps, narrow and steep, winding up 73 steps to the lamp room. She'd climbed them thousands of times. She knew every turn, every loose bolt, every place where the railing was worn smooth by her father's hand. But tonight, it felt different. She started climbing. The singing grew louder. It was definitely coming from above. She counted the steps as she went. 11, 12, 13. And with each step, the singing became clearer. It wasn't just a lullaby. It was the same line, repeated over and over. I'm going to try to hum it for you. Margaret included the melody in her letter. She wrote it out in musical notation, as best she could remember. I hummed the melody slowly. It's haunting, strange. Not quite minor key, but not major either. Something in between. Margaret reached the middle landing. This was the halfway point, where the staircase had a small platform before continuing upward. She'd stopped here 1,000 times to catch her breath. There was nothing on this landing, just stone walls and the curve of the next flight of stairs. But tonight, there was a door. I want you to understand what I'm telling you. Margaret had lived in that lighthouse her entire life. 32 years, she knew every stone, every bolt, every scratch on the walls, and there had never been a door on the middle landing. But now there was. It was wooden, dark, old. The grain of the wood was swollen, warped from moisture, as if it had been underwater for years, and it was open, just slightly, just enough to see darkness beyond it. The singing was coming from inside. Margaret stood on that landing, holding her candle, and she stared at that door. She knew with absolute certainty that it hadn't been there before. But there it was, and the singing continued, soft, sad, relentless. She should have run. She should have gone back down, locked herself in the keeper's house, and waited for dawn. But something stopped her. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was denial, or maybe it was something else, something that made her reach out and push the door open. I can hear the creak of that door in my mind as I read her words. The room beyond was small, maybe 8 feet across. The walls were stone, slick with moisture. There was no furniture, no windows, just a figure sitting in the corner, facing the wall. A woman. She had long black hair, hanging down past her waist in thick, wet strands. She was wearing a white dress, the kind women wore 100 years ago, with a high collar and long sleeves. The dress was soaked through, clinging to her body, dripping onto the stone floor, and she was rocking, back and forth, slow, rhythmic, singing that lullaby. Margaret's candle flickered. Her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. "Who are you?" The woman stopped singing. The rocking stopped, and slowly she began to turn her head. Margaret didn't wait to see her face. She ran. She dropped the candle, it went out as it hit the floor, and she ran in complete darkness. She stumbled up the stairs, her hands scraping against the iron railing, her boots clanging on the metal steps. She didn't stop until she reached the lamp room at the top of the tower. She slammed the door shut and locked it. Then she collapsed against it, gasping for air, her entire body shaking. I can hear the rain getting harder against my window now. It's almost as if the storm is responding to the story. The lamp was still burning, casting its beam out across the water. 4 seconds of light, 2 seconds of darkness. Margaret sat on the floor, her back pressed against the door, and she waited. Below her, in the staircase, she could hear the singing again. It was closer now. She covered her ears, but she could still hear it. It wasn't just coming from the staircase anymore. It was coming from inside the walls, from the stone itself, as if the entire lighthouse had become a throat, and the singing was rising up through it. Margaret looked at the door. The iron handle was turning. Slowly. Back and forth. Someone was trying to open it, but the lock held. The handle stopped moving. The singing stopped, and then Margaret heard something else. Scratching. Long, slow scratches. Fingernails dragging down the wood of the door, over and over, like someone trying to claw their way through. Margaret didn't move. She sat there, frozen, listening to the scratching. It went on for hours, or maybe minutes. She couldn't tell anymore. Time had stopped meaning anything. And then dawn came. The first light of morning filtered through the windows of the lamp room. The scratching stopped. The singing stopped. Everything stopped. Margaret waited another hour before she unlocked the door. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely turn the key. She opened it slowly, looking down into the staircase. Nothing. Just the iron steps, spiraling down into shadow. She descended carefully, step by step, until she reached the middle landing. The stone wall was solid, unbroken. There was no door, no opening, no sign that anything had been there. Margaret stood there for a long time, staring at the wall. She reached out and touched the stone. It was cold, dry, ordinary. She thought about leaving. She thought about walking into town and telling someone, anyone, what had happened. But who would believe her? And more than that, what would she say? So she stayed. She went down to the keeper's house. She made coffee. She ate a piece of bread. She opened the logbook and recorded the weather. Wind from the northeast. Seas rough. Visibility good. She didn't write about the door. She didn't write about the singing. But that afternoon, when she went up to prepare the lamp for the evening, she found something on the table in the lamp room. A photograph. It was old. The kind they took in the 1800s, on glass plates. The image was faded, yellowed with age. It showed a woman standing in front of the lighthouse. She was young, maybe 25, with long black hair and a white dress, and in her arms, wrapped in a blanket, was a baby. The woman wasn't smiling. She was staring directly at the camera with an expression Margaret couldn't quite read. Grief, maybe, or longing, or something deeper than either of those things. Margaret turned the photograph over. On the back, written in ink so faded she could barely make it out, were 3 words. "She is waiting." I have that photograph now. It's here on my desk as I record this. I'm looking at it. The woman's face is haunting. There's something in her eyes that makes my chest feel tight. Margaret kept that photograph. She put it in a drawer in the keeper's house, underneath her father's old maritime charts. She didn't look at it again for weeks. But every night, when she climbed to the lamp room, she wondered, who was the woman? Whose baby was she holding? And what was she waiting for? December 9th came and went. Then December 10th, Christmas, New Year's, January. The storms passed. Vernon came back with the supply boat in late January, and Margaret bought enough provisions to last through the winter. She didn't tell him about the door. She didn't tell him about the photograph. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it could be. But every December 9th, at midnight, Margaret heard the singing again. She never opened the door again. She never went down to the middle landing on that night. She stayed in the lamp room, door locked, and she listened. The singing would start just after midnight and continue until dawn. Always the same lullaby. Always the same soft, mournful voice. And every year, on December 10th, when she went down to the keeper's house, there would be something new. A small shoe, a tin rattle, a piece of cloth embroidered with a name she couldn't read. Margaret collected these things. She kept them in a wooden box in the back of her closet. She never told anyone about them. In 1975, Margaret wrote to the Coast Guard and officially registered as the keeper of Widow's Watch Lighthouse. By then, attitudes had changed. They accepted her application without question. She was 57 years old, and she'd been keeping that light burning for 35 years. She wrote letters sometimes, to old friends from school, to distant cousins, to me. I met Margaret once, in 1987. I was doing a radio piece on lighthouses, and someone told me about the woman who'd been keeping the light at Widow's Watch for nearly 50 years. I drove up to Maine in October, and I climbed those 73 steps to meet her. She was 79 years old, small, thin. Her hair was white, pulled back in a bun, but her eyes were sharp, alert, like she was always listening for something. We talked for hours. She told me about her father, about the routines of a keeper's life, about the ships she'd guided home over the decades. She was kind, patient. She made me tea and showed me how the lamp worked, but she didn't tell me about the door. Not until I was leaving. I was halfway down the stairs when she called after me. "Miss Brooks?" I turned around. She was standing at the top of the staircase, silhouetted against the light from the lamp room. "If you ever hear singing," she said, "don't open the door." I didn't understand what she meant. I thought maybe she was confused, or tired, or just speaking in metaphors the way old people sometimes do. I smiled and nodded and thanked her for her time. 2 years later, she sent me this letter. I'm holding it now. The pages are covered in her small, precise handwriting. She wrote everything. The door, the woman, the photograph, the singing, all of it. She said she was writing it down because she needed someone to know, someone to remember. She said she wasn't afraid anymore, but she wanted the truth to exist somewhere outside of her own mind. She mailed the letter in November 1989. I received it on December 12th. Margaret died on December 9th, 1989. They found her in the lamp room, sitting in her chair, facing the window. The light was still burning. The lens was perfectly clean. And on the table beside her was that photograph, the woman in the white dress, holding her baby. I need to take a breath. This part is difficult for me. The Coast Guard sent a new keeper, a man named Thomas Briggs. He lasted 4 days. He reported hearing singing on his first night. He left without explanation. 3 more keepers came and went over the next 2 years. None of them stayed longer than a month. One of them told me, off the record, that he heard scratching on his bedroom door every night at midnight. Another said he found a child's shoe on the stairs. When he picked it up, it crumbled to dust in his hands. The lighthouse was automated in 1992. No one lives there now. I went back to Widow's Watch last year. It was October again. Almost exactly 30 years since I'd first met Margaret. The lighthouse is still there, still operational, but the keeper's house is boarded up. The Coast Guard maintains the light remotely now. I walked out to the point. The wind was strong, coming in from the northeast. I stood on those rocks, the ones they used to call Widow's Watch, and I looked up at the tower. And I swear I heard it, singing, faint, distant, like it was coming from very far away, or from a long time ago. A lullaby in a language I didn't recognize. I talked to a fisherman in town afterward. His name was Dennis. He was in his 70s, born and raised there. I asked him if he knew anything about the lighthouse, about the woman in the photograph. He looked at me for a long time. Then he told me a story. In 1889, a woman named Elizabeth Cormier lived in the town. She was 19 years old, unmarried, and she was pregnant. Back then, that was a scandal. Her family disowned her. The father of the child, whoever he was, never came forward. Elizabeth had nowhere to go. The lighthouse keeper at the time was a man named Joseph Cormier, Elizabeth's uncle. He took her in, let her stay in the tower. People in town whispered about it, but Joseph didn't care. He said she was family, and family didn't abandon each other. Elizabeth gave birth in December. A little girl. The midwife said the baby was healthy, beautiful. Elizabeth named her Grace. 3 days later, Elizabeth walked out onto the rocks. She was carrying Grace in her arms. The keeper saw her from the tower and called out, but she didn't respond. She just kept walking, out to the edge of the point, where the waves break against the stone. And then she stepped off. They found her body 2 days later, washed up on the shore 3 miles south, but they never found the baby. Joseph searched for weeks. He walked the coastline every day, looking for any sign of Grace. He wrote in the keeper's log that he heard crying at night, coming from the rocks. He said he could hear Elizabeth singing to her baby, the same lullaby she'd sung every night when Grace was alive. Joseph Cormier kept the light at Widow's Watch for another 20 years, and every December 9th, the day Elizabeth died, he reported hearing singing in the tower. He died in 1909. Heart attack. They found him on the middle landing of the staircase, staring at the wall. Dennis told me that people in town have always known the lighthouse is haunted. They don't talk about it much. Bad for tourism, bad for property values. But everyone who's lived there long enough has heard the stories. Fishermen avoid sailing too close to the point on December 9th. Parents tell their children not to play on those rocks. And every year, someone reports hearing it. The singing, the lullaby. I think about Margaret a lot, about why she stayed, why she kept that light burning for 50 years, even after everything she'd seen, everything she'd heard. She could have left. She could have walked away and never looked back. But she didn't. I think she understood something the rest of us don't. That Elizabeth wasn't trying to scare anyone. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She was just looking for her baby, singing to her the way mothers do, waiting for her to come home. And maybe Margaret stayed because someone needed to bear witness, someone needed to remember, someone needed to keep the light burning, not just for the ships at sea, but for the ghosts who couldn't find their way home. I'm looking at the photograph again now, at Elizabeth, at baby Grace, and I wonder if they ever found each other, if the singing ever stopped. I called the Coast Guard last week. I asked them if they'd had any reports from Widow's Watch, maintenance issues, equipment malfunctions, anything unusual. The man I spoke to was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We don't send people there on December 9th anymore." I asked why. He said, "You know why. This is the part I haven't told anyone. The part I'm only saying now, on this recording, because I need it to be true somewhere other than in my own mind." Last December 9th, I drove back to Widow's Watch. I don't know why. Maybe because it was the anniversary of Margaret's death. Maybe because I needed to understand. I arrived just before midnight. The lighthouse was dark. The automated light wouldn't turn on until 1 a.m. I stood on the rocks, listening to the wind, watching the waves. And at midnight, I heard it. The singing. It was so clear, so close, like someone was standing right beside me. A woman's voice, soft and sad, singing that lullaby. I looked up at the lighthouse, and in the lamp room window, I saw a figure. A woman with long black hair, wearing a white dress. She was holding something in her arms, something small, wrapped in a blanket. She was looking down at me. And then the light turned on. The automated beacon blazed to life, and the beam swept across the water. 4 seconds of light, 2 seconds of darkness, and when the light came around again, she was gone. But the singing continued, all night, until dawn. I don't know what I saw. I don't know if it was real, or if my mind was playing tricks on me, or if grief and exhaustion and too many late nights had finally caught up with me. But I know what I heard, and I know what Margaret knew, that some voices don't fade, some songs don't end, and some people, some mothers, will search forever for the ones they've lost. Loneliness isn't the same as being alone. Margaret taught me that. You can be surrounded by silence and still hear the echoes of everyone who came before you. The lighthouse keepers, the sailors, the mothers singing lullabies to children who will never grow old. And maybe that's not haunting. Maybe that's just memory. The world trying to hold on to the people it's lost. I still have Elizabeth's photograph. I still have Margaret's letter. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is coming in from the northeast, I swear I can hear it. That lullaby. Soft, distant, endless. I don't know if it will ever stop. I don't know if it's supposed to. But I know someone is listening. And maybe that's enough. There's something else I need to tell you. Something I found recently that's been keeping me up at night. Last month, I received a package. No return address. Just my name and the address of this radio station, written in handwriting I didn't recognize. Inside was a small wooden box. Old, weathered. The kind of box you might find in an antique shop, tucked away in a corner, covered in dust. I opened it. Inside were objects. A small leather shoe, so tiny it could only have belonged to an infant. A tin rattle, tarnished with age. A piece of cloth with embroidery so faded I could barely make out the letters. And at the bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was another photograph. This one was different from the first. It showed the same woman, Elizabeth, but she was younger, maybe 17 or 18. She was smiling, standing on the beach with the lighthouse in the background, and she was holding the hand of a young man. He was tall, dark-haired, wearing the clothes of a fisherman. On the back of this photograph, in the same faded ink, were 4 words. He never came back. I spent days trying to figure out who sent me this box. I called the post office. I asked around town. No one knew anything. And then, last week I found something in the newspaper archives. An article from December 1889. It was brief, barely a paragraph. It reported that a fishing boat had gone down in a storm on December 3rd, 6 days before Elizabeth walked into the ocean. 3 men died. One of them was named Thomas Whitmore, age 21, unmarried. But he wasn't unmarried, was he? He had Elizabeth, and he had a baby on the way. I think I understand now what happened, why Elizabeth did what she did. Thomas died at sea. Elizabeth was alone, pregnant, disowned by her family. She had nothing, no money, no support, nowhere to go except to her uncle's lighthouse. And when Grace was born, Elizabeth must have looked at that tiny face and seen Thomas, seen everything she'd lost, everything that could have been. And on December 9th, 3 days after giving birth, she couldn't bear it anymore. She walked out onto those rocks, singing to Grace, the same lullaby she'd planned to sing for years, watching her daughter grow up. But she'd never get to see that, so she sang it one last time. And then she stepped into the ocean, taking Grace with her. I think that's what Margaret understood, that Elizabeth wasn't a monster. She wasn't evil. She was a young woman who'd lost everything and couldn't see a way forward. And now she's trapped, eternally searching for the baby she took with her, eternally singing that lullaby. hoping Grace will hear it and come back. But Grace is gone, lost to the sea 135 years ago, and Elizabeth will search forever, because that's what grief does. It traps you in a moment and won't let you move forward. I went back to the lighthouse 3 days ago. It was afternoon, not midnight. The sun was shining. The ocean was calm. I wanted to see it in daylight, without the shadows and the fear. I walked up to the tower. The door was locked, but there's a window on the first floor. And I looked inside. The keeper's house is empty now. Furniture covered in dust sheets, cobwebs in the corners. But on the table, in the center of the room, was the logbook. It was open. I couldn't see what page it was open to, but I knew. December 9th, either 1889 or 1970, or maybe every December 9th that's ever happened in that lighthouse. I walked around to the seaward side, where the rocks slope down to the water. This is where Elizabeth would have stood, where she would have looked down at the waves and made her decision. And I saw something that made my blood run cold. There were flowers on the rocks, fresh flowers, roses, white ones, tied with a ribbon, and next to them a child's toy, a small wooden boat, hand-carved, weathered by salt and wind. Someone had been there recently. Someone was still leaving offerings. I asked in town. The woman at the post office, the same one who couldn't tell me about the package, she got very quiet when I mentioned the flowers. Finally, she said, "We don't talk about that." I pressed her. I told her I needed to know. She looked around, as if checking that no one else could hear, and then she leaned in close. "Every year," she said, "on December 9th, someone leaves flowers and a toy on those rocks. No one knows who. We've tried to catch them. We've had people watch all night, but somehow, between dusk and dawn, the offerings appear. It's been happening for as long as anyone can remember." I asked if she thought it was Elizabeth, if she thought the ghost was leaving offerings to her own lost child. The woman shook her head. "No," she said. "I think it's someone who understands, someone who knows what it's like to lose everything." I think she might be right. I think somewhere in that town, maybe in every generation, there's someone who understands Elizabeth's pain, someone who's lost a child, or a love, or a future they'd planned. And they go to those rocks on December 9th, and they leave something behind. Not for Elizabeth, but for all of us, for everyone who's ever been trapped by grief. I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to leave this recording here and walk away. I'm not going to edit it. I'm not going to clean it up, or add music, or make it presentable. I'm just going to let it exist, exactly as it is, with all my pauses and trembling voice, and moments of uncertainty. Because I think that's what Margaret wanted when she sent me that letter. Not a polished story, not a performance, just the truth, messy and raw and human. I keep thinking about something she wrote at the end of her letter. I almost didn't mention it because it's so personal, so vulnerable, but I think it's important. She wrote, "I stayed because someone had to. Not for the ships. They have GPS now, radar, all sorts of modern navigation. They don't need a lighthouse keeper anymore. I stayed because Elizabeth needed someone to witness her grief, someone to remember that she existed, that Grace existed, that their story mattered." And then she wrote something that I think about every single day. We're all lighthouse keepers in a way. All of us keeping lights burning for people who are lost. All of us hoping that someone, somewhere, is keeping a light burning for us. I wish I could have told Margaret that I understand, that I see what she did, that her 50 years in that tower, alone with the ghosts and the singing and the endless rhythm of the light, weren't wasted. But she died before I fully understood her letter, before I made the connection between Elizabeth and Thomas and the baby, before I realized that the lighthouse wasn't just keeping ships safe, it was keeping memory safe. There's a writer I love. I can't remember her name right now, but she said something about how we die twice, once when our heart stops beating, and once when someone says our name for the last time. If that's true, then Elizabeth and Grace and Margaret are all still alive. Because I'm saying their names right now, because you're listening to their stories, because somewhere, someone will hear this and remember. I wonder sometimes if that's what the singing is. Not a haunting, not a curse, but a refusal to be forgotten. Elizabeth singing Grace's lullaby, over and over, because as long as the song continues, Grace still exists. And Margaret, sitting in that lamp room year after year, was conducting that song, keeping it alive, making sure it never faded into silence. I received another letter 2 weeks ago. This one was from a woman named Sarah. She's 34 years old, and she just moved to the town near Widow's Watch. She wrote to me because she heard about my radio piece on lighthouses, and she wanted to tell me something. She's a single mother. Her daughter is 3 years old. And last December 9th, she felt a pull, she couldn't explain it, to walk out to the lighthouse. She arrived just before midnight. She brought flowers, white roses, and a small toy boat she'd carved herself. She left them on the rocks where Elizabeth had stood. And then she heard it. The singing, the lullaby. But Sarah said she wasn't afraid. She said it was the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard. She said she sat on those rocks and listened until dawn. And when the sun came up, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She wrote, "I don't know if Elizabeth found Grace. I don't know if the singing will ever stop. But I know that for one night, I wasn't alone in my grief. And that made all the difference." That's when I understood. That's when everything Margaret had tried to tell me finally made sense. The lighthouse isn't just about keeping ships safe. It's about connection. It's about saying to everyone out there in the darkness, "I see you. You're not alone. Keep going." And the singing isn't a curse. It's a lifeline. It's Elizabeth reaching out across time, across death, across everything that separates us, and saying, "I was here. I loved someone. I lost them. And that mattered." We all have our own form of singing, don't we? Our own way of reaching out into the darkness, hoping someone will hear us. Some of us write letters. Some of us make art. Some of us sit alone in radio studios at 3 in the morning, recording stories we hope will matter to someone, somewhere. And some of us keep lights burning in towers by the sea. I'm going to go back to Widow's Watch next December 9th. I'm going to bring flowers and a small wooden boat. I'm going to sit on those rocks and listen. And if I hear the singing, I'm going to sing back. Not the same lullaby, I don't know the words, but something. Some sound that says, "I hear you, Elizabeth. Your story mattered. Grace's life mattered. You are not forgotten." Maybe that's all any of us want, to know that we mattered, that our loves and our losses and our small acts of courage weren't invisible. Margaret kept that light burning for 50 years. And now I'm keeping her light burning. And maybe someone listening to this will keep it burning after I'm gone. That's how we defeat the darkness. Not by pretending it doesn't exist, but by holding up our small lights and saying, "Here I am. I'm still here." I started this recording hours ago. I can see the sun coming up outside my studio window. I should be tired, but I'm not. I feel more awake than I have in years. This is Evelyn Brooks. Thank you for listening to Echoes of 1970. Keep your lights burning. Someone out there in the darkness needs to see them. Good night.